Hey guys, welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. Tonight we're tackling a question that has haunted every republic and every democracy and civilization that has ever attempted to govern itself. What happens when the institutions designed to serve the people gradually become serving themselves? More specifically, what happens when the executive branch, the very institution tasked with enforcing the law, begins operating with less oversight and less accountability and more concentrated power? This is not a discussion about one president, one administration, or one political party. This is a discussion about power itself. Because throughout human history, the power has demonstrated one constant characteristic. Once required, it rarely gives itself up willingly. The founders of the constitutional democracies understood this as a reality better than most. They recognized that the government was necessary, but they also understood that the government left unchecked could become a threat and the very liberties it was created to protect. They understood that the understanding gave rise to the concepts of separation of powers, checks and balances, and institutional oversight. These were not merely political theories, they were safeguards designed to protect the ordinary citizens from the natural tendencies of power to expand. Yet, despite these safeguards, history tells a familiar story. The executive branches across the world, regardless of ideology, political party, or national identity, have consistently sought greater authority and broader direction, and an increased control. Sometimes this expansion occurs openly. Sometimes it occurs gradually, but almost always it occurs under the prime promise of necessity. When people hear the word corruption, they often imagine secret meetings, envelopes full of cash, or an elaborate criminal conspiracy. But the corruption is often far more subtle than that. In fact, some of the most damaging forms of corruption are entirely legal. Corruption can emerge when loyalty becomes more valuable than the competence. It can emerge when influence outweighs the expertise. And it can emerge when public office becomes less about serving citizens and more about preserving the power and protecting the allies or securing future opportunities. Consider the political patronage. Throughout history, executives have rewarded supporters and donors, advisors, and political allies with positions of influence. While such appointments are not always illegal, they raise an important question. When the individuals owe their positions primarily to the political loyalty, where does their true allegiance lie? Is it the Constitution, to the public, or to the people who elevated them to power? This creates a dangerous cycle. Institutions that were designed to act independently can slowly transform into networks or mutual protection, where criticism becomes betrayal and accountability becomes political warfare. Then there is the revolving door between government and private industry. A government official regulates an industry for years and develops the relationships and gains insider knowledge, and then leaves public service to accept a lucrative position within the very industry they were once oversaw. Technically, this may be legal, but legality and legitimacy are not always the same thing. When citizens witness public officials moving seamlessly between government power and private profit, confidence in the impartiality of institutions begins to erode, and the trust once lost is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Another dimension of executive corruption involves something even more fundamental: the information itself. Democracy depends upon an informed public as well. Citizens cannot make meaningful decisions if they lack the access to accurate information about how they are governed. Yet throughout history, governments have often sought to manage information as aggressively as they manage policy. The transparency is celebrated publicly, while secrecy frequently becomes the operational reality. Of course, governments often justify their secrecy in the name of national security and public safety or institutional stability. And sometimes those justifications are legitimate. But history also teaches us that the secrecy can become a shield behind which incompetence and misconduct and abuses of power remain hidden from the public scrutiny. Perhaps nowhere in this expansion of executive authority they are more visible than during times of crisis. Wars, terrorist attacks, economic collapses, the public health emergencies, and civil unrest. Every crisis creates the pressure for the immediate action, and citizens demand security. Politicians demand solutions, our institutions demand flexibility, and in those moments, executives are often granted the extraordinary powers to address the extraordinary circumstances. The problem is that temporary powers have a remarkable tendency to become permanent. Our history teaches us repeatedly, and it also demonstrates that emergency measures, once implemented, are rarely surrendered entirely. The authorities expanded during one crisis often remains available for the next, and over time, what was once considered extraordinary gradually becomes normal, and what becomes normal eventually becomes unquestioned. But perhaps one of the most dangerous forms of corruption is not financial corruption or political corruption, it is informational corruption. This occurs when our institutions become so polarized and so tribal and so invested in controlling the narratives that truth itself becomes secondary to our political advantage. Every investigation becomes a political attack, and every criticism becomes the propaganda for the scandal, which becomes someone else's conspiracy. At this point, accountability begins to collapse, not because the oversight mechanisms no longer exist, but because the citizens themselves can no longer agree on what constitutes legitimate oversight. Money also plays a role, and it's undeniable in the modern executive system. The political campaigns require enormous financial resources, of course. The lobbying organizations spend billions of dollars influencing policy, and our political action committees wield extraordinary influence. Major donors gain access that ordinary citizens often do not. But the reality raises a difficult but necessary question when executive officials make their decisions. Whose interests are they truly representing? The voters who elected them? The institutions that support them? Or is it the donors who finance them? Maybe the political machinery required to maintain the power itself could be the issue. But the perception of undue influence can damage democratic legitimacy because the democracies ultimately rely on something more important than laws or institutions. They rely on the public's trust. And perhaps that brings us to the greatest danger of all. The greatest danger is not corruption itself or corruption which has always existed. The greatest danger is the public's acceptance of corruption as inevitable. When citizens begin to believe that the corruption is simply how politics works, accountability begins to fail. Cynicism replaces the civic engagement. Distrust replaces participation. Political loyalty replaces independent judgment. And eventually the people stop asking whether government is serving the public and begin asking only which faction is benefiting from the system. That is the moment when corruption ceases to be an exception and becomes part of the political culture itself. To be clear, I want to be clear about this, like crystal clear. This is not an argument that every executive official is corrupt, nor that every institution is, irreparably broken. Democratic systems possess the mechanisms designed for self-correction, and independent courts, investigative journalists, legislative oversight, and inspectors generals, as well as whistleblowers and transparency laws, and ultimately the judgment of informed citizens. These institutions, they all exist because the architects of democracy understood that a timeless truth no person and no institution should ever possess: unlimited power without accountability. So perhaps the most important question is not whether corruption exists within the executive government. History has already answered that question. The real question is whether citizens remain willing to confront the corruption consistently, regardless of its ideology, political affiliation, or its personal preference. Because corruption does not begin when the laws are broken. Corruption begins when our societies decide that certain individuals and certain institutions, or even certain political victories, have become so important to question. And in an age of growing polarization, the expanding executive authority, and declining trust in the public institutions, we must ask ourselves one final question. Are we simply witnessing the normal struggles of democracy? Or are we watching the gradual erosion of accountability itself? I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. If you found this discussion thoughtful or thought-provoking, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below, because preserving democracy ultimately requires more than participation. It requires vigilance. Until next time, as always, I want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.